So, freedom and liberty, I guess I don't need to tell you, are key words in American political and cultural history. As a nation, the United States celebrates itself, its system of governance, and its economy as models for the world, precisely because of this country's commitments to freedom and to liberty. On the international stage, about which I've just done some writing, the United States has often understood itself as advancing the cause of freedom worldwide, advocating that all people enjoy the freedoms that, as Americans, understand them. And as some of the images up here show you, and I'm thinking particularly of this one with its sparkling torch, celebrations of the United States as a land of freedom have become closely and in very complex ways associated with the Statue of Liberty, and through the statue, of course, with immigration to the United States. The steady attraction of immigrants to the United States itself has often symbolized the unique dimensions of American freedom. For immigration has made the United States, as these images suggest, a multi-ethnic or multiracial nation of immigrants where all enjoy freedom on equal grounds. Now, this association of American freedom with immigration, and thus with movement and mobility, is both deeply inspiring, but also somewhat troubling. Let me begin with the inspirational part first, and then tackle some of the problems that I see in associating freedom so exclusively with immigration. Okay. Here before you, you see text taken from an 1868 treaty that actually proclaimed, quote, the inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance. This treaty's association of freedom with rights is quite typical of 18th century political philosophy, and it actually provides a good starting point for my own discussion of what I call the freedom to move. This treaty's assertion of the inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance provides actually the best statement of Americans' commitment to the freedom to move that I have found, at least for the 19th century. And this treaty was one of dozens of trade treaties that the United States signed with foreign states between 1776 and 1870. Its partners in those treaties included Sweden, yes, Norway, Great Britain, France, and Germany, all in Europe. But the US also signed similar treaties with most of the newly independent countries of Central and South America. Now, the purpose of these treaties, including the one that you see before you there, was to encourage trade between two countries. But trade would be encouraged by guaranteeing the freedom of the citizens of both countries to move about freely between the two. The freedom of men in both countries to live, to work in either country, and to choose which country would have their loyalties, a process that we here in America call naturalization. Now, this particular treaty is called the Burlingame Treaty, and it guaranteed to both American citizens and Chinese subjects the same rights to choose where they lived, to move back and forth and within both countries freely, and of course, to change their allegiance as they chose. Treaties like these, in other words, I think, built the foundation for what historians have labeled the mass, unrestricted immigrations of the 19th century. These treaties were the foundation for the nation of immigrants. As you've probably recognized in that phrase, the inalienable rights, the language of these 19th century treaties was deeply influenced by the revolutionary and democratic aspirations of the Enlightenment and its arguments about freedom that circulated all Atlantic societies in the 18th century. In these treaties, we hear echoes of both the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man, rights again, but also the language of the American revolutionaries, including Thomas Jefferson, who famously, in the Declaration of Independence, here, declared, among the inalienable rights of man were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For Jefferson, as for the diplomat Burlingame 100 years later, the pursuit of happiness was absolutely unimaginable without the freedom to move and without the right of man to choose their own rulers by doing so. Now, in this talk, I want you to consider whether or not the same is true today. I will ask you to think about how the freedom to move and the pursuit of happiness are entwined. And I will ask you to ponder the very difficult question of who and under what circumstances people should possess the power to limit the freedom to move or even outright deny it. While the freedom to move was certainly a freedom that American political leaders of the 18th and 19th centuries proclaimed to be inalienable, it was not at that time actually enjoyed by all. And it is not enjoyed by most people in the world today. My goal in discussing the freedom to move is actually not to tell you who should enjoy that freedom or who should restrict that freedom, but rather to provide you with a series of perspectives and observations about the past that will allow you to consider for yourself what the freedom of move should be and who should enjoy it and what limits could be placed upon it. Now, as a historian of American immigration, I've long been fascinated, but also troubled by the rhetoric and the celebrations that link American freedom so tightly to American immigration. And let me point to three dimensions of this association of freedom and immigration that have, at times, troubled me. First, I'm troubled by the implicit assumption that the freedom of movement is somehow of greater importance to immigrants and foreigners than it has been to other human beings, including those of us who are raised and born in the United States. And on this particular point, the perspective of world history is useful. I teach world history, by the way, so this is where all this comes from, actually, the classroom. World historians have rather firmly established that moving about, even across very large distances, is not necessarily an extraordinary act, nor is it one that has been unique to the United States. On the contrary, we world historians have growing, literally, piles of evidence that over the long history of human life on Earth, movement and migration have been common, if not quite the norm. Some world historians even argue that humans are a mobile species, and that it has been the willingness of human beings, perhaps driven by instinct, to move across social and cultural borders that has provided the engine driving social evolution and the historical development of ever more complex human societies. Now, actually, personally, I don't think that mobility is instinctual. And I actually don't believe there is something called social evolution that can be attributed to human instinct. But I am convinced that moving about, mobility, and migration have been central in most, and have characterized, in fact, most human cultures. After all, as this map should remind us, all modern human beings originated in Africa. And over the subsequent 60,000 years, they literally walked, whoops, I'm not quite used to this. They literally walked, or in some cases took short boat rides, and populated the entire Earth. And then, for the next 15,000 years, those human beings remained mobile in their everyday lives. They were hunters and gatherers. They moved cyclically every year throughout extensive territories that were usually up to 200 square miles in extent. The centrality of movement from the very beginnings of human life on Earth may help us to understand why the thinkers of the Enlightenment, men like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who thought about men in their natural state and re-achieving that natural state through modern forms of governance, why those people actually imagined the freedom to move as an inalienable right, as we saw in the language of the Burlingame Treaty. American history, too, I'm sure you know, is literally brimming with mobile people, with people on the move, and with people experiencing sharp changes in their language, their environment, and their culture. So my point number 2, and my second sense of dissatisfaction with associating the freedom to move exclusively with immigrants, comes from the fact that Americans, as much as immigrants, have been very concerned with their own, with our own freedom to move about freely and as they choose. The pursuit of happiness has meant lives on the move, both for those born in the United States and for foreigners coming to the United States. How many of you, for example, live today in the town where you were born? And how many of you live even in the same state where you were born? According to the Pew Charitable Trust, more than 60% of Americans today have moved away from their birthplace, and half live outside the state of their birth. And it's also worth noting, since we're here in Illinois, that the Pew demographers who made that chart also found that the American Midwest is actually much below the national average on both of these 2 points. They call the American Midwest the stickiest of the American regions because it's most effective somehow in holding on to its own natives. Something we could talk about, but I can assure you that 100 years ago the Midwest was not the stickiest region, and that in fact people born outside the state and outside the country were in fact the majority of the residents of Minnesota, for example, my own home state. Thus, while yes, of course, immigrants have moved long distances and they have crossed cultural, political, and linguistic boundaries in doing so, so have many, and at times most, Americans. Just as much as immigrants, Americans have moved about in pursuit of happiness. And in moving, the definitions of the happiness that they pursued often resembled that of immigrants. Let me just point to 4 motivations that Americans and foreigners as immigrants have had in common. I'll get it eventually. Was the pursuit of happiness in the form of improved livelihood really more important to the immigrant Swedes who settled in the upper Midwest than it was to the immigrants from New England or Ohio? I very much doubt that was the case. Across American history, new and expanding sites of work and economic development, whether the gold mines of California, here, the homesteads of the West, here, the industries and mines, the factories and mines of Pittsburgh in the 1910s, or even in the meat processing plants of today. All of these sites of economic development have drawn both immigrants and Americans as migrants and as workers. Whether immigrants or Americans, the migrants to the West and migrants to factories typically found themselves living and working in environments that were new and where much from the climate, as a newcomer to Minnesota, the climate is kind of a shock to me, whether the climate or their neighbors could seem very strange to them. Yes, I think the cultural shock that accompanied movement was greater for immigrants than it was for Americans, but it was scarcely absent even from the Americans' experience of mobility. While the search for a job and for greater economic opportunity or higher wages continues to be the most common reason given both by Americans and by immigrants today, those 2 groups also explain their moves through desires related to family life. the desire to marry, to live with or reunite families, and to live in familiar communities. These motives for both groups never lags far behind the economic motivations. For immigrants and for most Americans, happiness means marrying whomever you please, living with that person, creating families, homes, and communities with people you love and whom you resemble culturally. In fact, moving away from one's parents and home is almost a rite of passage for young Americans, which is why when they moved back home recently in response to the financial crisis, their decisions have seemed so troubling and so shocking. We were talking about this actually at dinner. The desire to live close to family for older migrants, or to reunite families that are separated through earlier migrations, are important to both Americans and to immigrants. It's the reason, for example, that the largest number of Black Americans give when they return in large numbers to the South, as they have over the last 3 decades. In 1905, 95% of immigrants told Ellis Island agents that they were traveling to join a previously migrated family member. And today, as you see here, 2/3 of all immigrants coming to the United States do so with visas reserved for the reunification of families. Whether you were a Minnesotan who moved to California in 1910, or a Somali who moves to Minneapolis in 2010, chances are you chose to go there to live with people of a similar background. You created communities that worshiped together. You joined organizations that celebrated your own roots and heritage, and you enjoyed forms of entertainment and recreation that were familiar from your place of birth far away. Working class Italians, including my own family in New Jersey in 1910, went to picnics. Minnesotans in 1910 living in LA went to picnics with other Minnesotans. Americans today actually reserve special labels for words like asylum seeker, or refugee, for the foreigners who seek safety by coming to the United States, fleeing environmental disaster or religious or ethnic persecution. But we shouldn't forget that Americans, too, have repeatedly traveled in search of safety. Runaway slaves provide the most obvious example of American natives who had to move in order to be safe, to literally protect their own skin from beatings and punishment. Mormons, too, left Illinois for Utah, which was then part of Mexico, by the way, in order to seek safety after the murder of their main religious leader. More recently, the residents of New Orleans who fled Hurricane Katrina's flooding may have resented being called refugees because they weren't foreigners after all. But their suffering and their fears very much resembled those of both the Irish, who fled the potato famine of the late 1840s, or here you see the Mexicans, who fled revolution in Mexico into Texas in the 1910s. This search for safety, the third important motivation that both natives and foreigners have shared, also leads migrants to a place that they imagine as offering not just safety, but also more freedoms. And that's the final of the 4 motives to move that I want to emphasize as shared between the 2 groups. It's difficult to argue that only immigrants seek freedom, as is suggested here in this kind of iconic portrait of immigrants approaching the Statue of Liberty in the 19th century. I've already given several examples of natives seeking freedom on this screen. Consider, for example, that the Ojibwa first came to Minnesota from the St. Lawrence River Valley and the eastern Great Lakes regions in the middle and later years of the 18th century in search of freedom. As hunters and gatherers, they literally could not live in freedom as they understood it so long as Europeans continued to invade their territories, cut down their forests, transform land into private property, and otherwise engage in cultural and armed conflict with them. Freedom for the Ojibwa, too, at least at that point in their history, meant migrating west. The history of African Americans, of course, is full of freedom. Running away to safety was simultaneously a move toward freedom. So was travel on the Underground Railroad. Here. That first took them to the free states of the North, and then after the infamous Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, took them farther away and into Ontario. In 1860, there were 60,000 African Americans living in Ontario, and they had gone there for freedom. Migration, the migration of African Americans to northern cities between 1910 and 1965 undoubtedly was motivated by the desire for an improved livelihood. But there can be no doubt, in fact, African Americans at the time said they were traveling to freedom. And freedom meant many things to them at that time. It meant the freedom to sit anywhere or to travel on a streetcar or a railroad. It might mean the freedom to send their children to school or to an integrated school. It might mean the freedom to vote, to run for office, or to serve as an elected official. Now, so far, I've emphasized mainly that the freedom to move was central to the pursuit of happiness for both natives and immigrants. My last and third objection to the too exclusive association of immigration with freedom is closely associated with the last examples I've provided on the last two slides, especially for African Americans and for American Indians, but also for some immigrant groups as well. Movement and migration were not always freely chosen. Today, most people differentiate immigrants and refugees because refugees are believed to have been more coerced than voluntary in their arrival in the United States. But the largest groups of coerced movers in American history have not been refugees from abroad, but rather American Indians and African Americans. And there are actually two ways that coercion has figured in their history of movement: as forced migrations and as prohibitions on the freedom to move. Both these forms of coercion loom large in the histories of African American and Native Americans, and also in the histories of immigration from Asia. Yet if we just focus on immigration as a form and a pursuit of freedom, coercion disappears as a theme. It disappears in celebratory stories of the United States as a nation of immigrants. So let me focus just for a minute on the issue of coercion, the absence of freedom and restraints on the freedom to move. World historians remind us that the forced removal of 13 million Africans as slaves to the Americas during the early modern era was the largest forced migration in human history. Given the long history of slavery in the United States, it is little wonder that most African Americans today find it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to see themselves as partners in the American nation of immigrants. Even though the search for safety and the search for freedom also repeatedly encouraged African Americans to move about voluntarily in very large numbers, African Americans tend to be cautious in celebrating the freedom to move. In fact, when I gave another talk that addressed this issue, a young African American philosopher kind of challenged me and said, explain to me why the freedom to move is more interesting or more important as a subject of study than the freedom to stay where you are. The freedom to remain sedentary. A point to which I'll return in a minute. And that is a perspective that is easily shared by peoples whose history include moments of forced migration. The images here of the Trail of Tears are a reminder of the forced removal of thousands upon thousands of American Indians of the Southeast to the so-called reservations or Indian territories. The Trail of Tears, in this case, ended in Oklahoma. Also, nurture skepticism about the value of the freedom to move. So, later in American Indian history, did the removal of thousands of children from Indian families forced to attend boarding schools that taught them English, that cut their hair, and that transformed them culturally to the degree that many of them could not and did not want to return to their older homes. Immigrants from Asia also learned about the coercion of being forced to move. Here, of course, we see the order to the Japanese that they must leave the West Coast and go to detention camps after President Roosevelt proclaimed them, citizens and aliens alike, to be a threat to American safety and security in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Historically then, coercion in the form of forced migration usually is accompanied by or followed by restrictions and prohibitions against movement. And in both cases, it's restrictions and limits placed on the freedom of movement that these histories show us. Thus, for example, Africans forced as migrants to colonial America or forced westward as slaves to the new cotton-growing regions of Trans-Appalachia were not only forced to move, but they were then prohibited from moving on their own volition. Slaves have no freedom to move, and that is why slavery then and now is compared, not improbably, to prison. Driven into slavery, one is prohibited from exiting it. Prohibition on African Americans' freedom to move continued even after the end of slavery. The images on this screen here show a man who is being forced into indentured bondage for the failure to repay his debts after the Civil War. Throughout the United States, even after 1865, black codes and state laws simply prohibited African Americans from entering or settling in certain counties and cities. In fact, if you wish, you can imagine the Jim Crow laws themselves as prohibiting movement into large spaces that are designated either white or black. So too, the ethnic cleansing represented in the previous slide by the Trail of Tears ended on a reservation from which, an Indian territory, from which Indians departed only at great risk. And as this other image suggests, when people are forced to leave the West Coast as Japanese Americans, they then are confined within a space that, to our eyes, looks like a prison. And it was, essentially, a prison. Finally, as this last, not very good image, I'm afraid, of African American chain gang workers or railroad men suggests, the prison symbolizes the close relationship of these two forms of coercion that eliminate the freedom to move. So when I think back to this young, challenging African American woman who said, "What's so great about the freedom to move?" I now would argue, you don't have the freedom to stay put if you don't also have the freedom to move. You get one, or you get them both, or you get neither. At least that's how it looks in American history. Now, having laid out the meaning and the significance of the freedom to move, I have actually and inevitably skipped across time in a fashion that is quite unbecoming and uncharacteristic, actually, of an historian, which is what I am. So let me shift very briefly now and begin to move towards my conclusion by returning to the preferred chronological approach that historians take and tell you a very brief history of the freedom to move in America in a more chronological sense. First and foremost, I think, we cannot understand Americans' commitment to the freedom to move in the 19th century without understanding the coercions and the restraints placed on movement on many people during the colonial era. The United States was reacting against a British world where the coercion was central and characteristic. European empire building in the Americas was based on coercion, it was based on slavery, but it was also based on indenture. 80% of the Europeans who came to North America came as indentured servants who had sold themselves into servitude for 7 years or so. And both the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution essentially try to establish that that kind of restriction on the freedom to move, at least for white people, will not continue. That's how we need to understand that commitment to the inalienable right of man to change his home as a reaction, an anti-imperial reaction to the colonial world. Nevertheless, as I'm sure you know, the American Constitution accepted slavery and it limited naturalization to whites and Europeans only. The period between 1790 and 1870 was a period of questioning. It's during this period when the first questions begin to arise about the freedom of immigrants to move about freely. And it's already in the 1820s and 1830s when the first demands for restrictions on immigration are made. At the same time, this is the period when the coercion that was part of the history of both African Americans and Native Americans comes under question. This is the period of the abolitionist movement. And there were, in fact, many white Americans who objected vehemently to Andrew Jackson's insistence that the Native Americans be pushed west. One of them, Davy Crockett, said, if they kick the natives out of North Carolina, I'm leaving this country. And he did. He went to Texas, which was then an independent country, as I'm sure you know. So the first demands for immigration restriction are emerging, and the first demands for ending this coercion and restrictions on African Americans and Native Americans in the form of slavery and reservations are emerging. What we see, of course, across the next century and a half of American history is one of two interesting patterns, kind of wrestling with each other, if you will. There have been moments when advocates of African Americans and Native Americans advocate for freedoms and fewer restrictions at exactly the same time that fans of immigration also advocate for fewer restrictions. But more often, as arguments for removing restrictions on African Americans and Native Americans are made, the demand that restrictions be placed on immigrants increase. And I haven't quite worked out why it should have played out this way, but that's the pattern we see over time. In 1965, we see growing restraints placed on the freedom of immigrants movement, and we see diminishing coercion and restraints on the movements of African Americans and Native Americans. This is a very complex story, and there is a moment in the 50s and 60s when advocates for immigrants and advocates for African Americans are both arguing for greater freedom. But more typically, as one gains, the other loses. That's a correlation. That's not a causation. And the mechanisms and reasons that it plays out in this way is something many more historians, I think, need to think about. In any case, in 1964, as I'm sure you know, the United States passes the Civil Rights Act, and in 1965, it passes a new immigration law. The purpose of that immigration law was to remove racial and national origin quotas. But what too few of us recognize is that, in fact, the 1965 law imposed on all immigrants from every part of the world for the first time numerical restrictions. 30,000 Canadians, 30,000 Mexicans, 250,000 worldwide. X from the Western Hemisphere, X from the Eastern Hemisphere. And that is the end, basically, of the inalienable right of immigrants to change their home and their allegiance. And that is the condition in which we continue to live today. Today, all Americans enjoy the right to move. But we have, in the United States and in every other country in the world, restrictions on our borders. And that understanding, freedom within the territory of a nation and restrictions at the border, is characteristic of the entire world, as this slide will remind you. This is the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which proclaims everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of a state. Everyone has the right to leave a country, including his own, and to return to his own country. Everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. But if you're not seeking asylum from persecution, you do not have the right to enter any other country of the world. Think about what that means for a minute. So who actually today in the world supports the inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance? I want to end my talk with 4 points that are really more provocations to you for further thought than they are firm conclusions still. I do think it's obvious that even during this peak 19th century American enthusiasm for the idea that man enjoys the inalienable right to change his home and allegiance, the freedom to move was firmly circumscribed, and Americans then, as now, held deeply paradoxical attitudes towards this freedom. In the 19th century, when European foreigners could freely move to the United States, and when both foreigners and citizens could move about as they chose within the United States, it was coercion and not freedom that characterized public policies towards those who were slaves or natives, not white, not European. In fact, that treaty with which I began my talk, that 1868 treaty with which I began my talk, symbolizes the ambivalence of this period because it initiated an ultimately successful campaign to exclude the Chinese with whom the treaty had been signed. The Chinese, the American Congress, told its diplomats, would not enjoy the inalienable right to change their home and allegiance. And Congress literally sent a message to the president that said, send those diplomats back there, that treaty has to be revised. And it was. There's a second illustration of the ambivalence Americans have had about the freedom to move, which I want to call attention to. As white Americans gradually embraced the idea that all Americans, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of ethnicity, should enjoy the freedom to move about within the United States, the campaign to restrict immigration and place numerical limits on immigration rose and progressively advanced. Now, actually, once achieved, the freedom of all Americans to move around freely within the country has been accompanied by a decline in the actual numbers and percentages of people who have exercised that freedom. We don't know why that took place. Worldwide today, but we do know that people are in many ways in the United States less mobile than they used to be. Worldwide too, only 3% of people living, only 3% of all the people in the world live outside the country of their birth. 100 years ago, it was probably 2 to 3 times that rate, that proportion. A recent global survey has suggested that about 15% of all the people living in the world today would like to move to some other country. They have no hope of doing so. Restrictions on movements across borders into the United States or into any other country, for that matter, have become too difficult and too expensive, literally, even to contemplate. And most countries of the world don't even have provisions for what we call naturalization. I think it's extremely useful to juxtapose this ambivalence that Americans have felt towards the freedom to move in the past and in the present, as I have done in this talk. It is so easy to look back at the Founding Fathers and at men like Jefferson and to see the contradictions in their thought and their way of life. It is so easy to see that they wanted the freedom to move for themselves even as they owned slaves or throw Native Americans away from those East Coast states. It's easy to observe the Trail of Tears and the coercion and the denials of freedom represented by slavery and the Trail of Tears. And every one of my students, with refreshing optimism, but naive optimism, always believes that if I'd lived in the 19th century, I would have seen these contradictions. I would have protested them. I would have done the right thing. But when we think about our own contradictions, most of us, in fact, think, and for a very long time I thought, it was completely normal and natural and right that you can move about freely within a country, and you can leave it, but you can't go anywhere else without the permission of some other country. But do you actually have the freedom to leave your country if you have no other place to go to? That's the contradiction that we embrace and that we accept as natural. And not only as Americans, that's the contradiction that's central to the UN Declaration on Human Rights. My guess is that most of my students, perhaps most of you, just think that's normal, that's natural, that's the way it always has been. My job has been to show you that that is not the way it has always been. Finally, I think this focus on the freedom to move, rather than on immigration as the builder of the American nation of immigrants, raises very important questions about the relationships between people who move about and people who stay put, mobile and sedentary people. American ambivalence towards the freedom to move suggests that there's something scary about mobility itself. And I want to ask you to think about where that fear comes from. I have my own kind of crazy world history sort of explanations, but I ask you to think about it. We're often told that the fear of the stranger or of the foreigner is a human universal, and it's an inevitable consequence of distinguishing between insiders and outsiders. But aren't strangers and foreigners also inevitably people on the move? Think about the role of the outside agitator in U.S. political history. Think about the latest headlines that say money is coming from outside to support one side or the other side of the marriage amendment debate that's going on in Minnesota. Those are headlines that I saw just in the last 2 weeks. Fears of mobile people who are moving around suggests that somehow the world would be a better place and a happier place if all people and all human beings just stayed where they were born. And yet world historians have convinced me, and I hope I have convinced you, that that has never been the case. Movement has been ubiquitous, and even if you don't buy the world historian's argument that movement makes the world a better place, you'd better be prepared to move and to confront people who have moved, because they are going to be part of your life. In other words, when we think about the freedom to move, a great deal seems to be at stake, not only for Americans, but for all human beings. I hope at the very least I have challenged you to begin to examine your own assumptions and encouraged you to think about the complex relationship of freedom and movement, about the relationship of mobile Americans and mobile immigrants, and about what it is that we have to celebrate when we describe the United States as a nation of immigrants. Thank you very much.